He smuggled his mistress into the hospital room where his wife wept over her dying father, dressed her in red, stood her at the door like a trophy, and slid divorce papers across the bedsheet with a grin. He never thought to ask why a janitor's daughter wore no jewelry but owned no debt. The monitors beeped in slow, rhythmic pulses, like a metronome counting down the final measures of a life well lived. The room smelled of antiseptic and fresh lilies. Margaret always brought lilies for her father, had done so every Sunday since she was 7 years old, back when he would lift her onto his shoulders and call her his million-dollar girl. She didn't know then how literally he had meant it. Margaret Elaine Okafor sat beside the hospital bed, her blue evening gown pooling around the chair like a quiet sea. She had come straight from the charity gala where her husband, Dominic, had insisted she make an appearance. For optics, he had said, straightening his cufflinks without looking at her. She had smiled through 3 hours of polite conversation, excused herself the moment her sister called, and driven 40 minutes through the rain to reach her father's side. Her father, Joseph Emmanuel Elias, lay against the white pillows with his eyes half open, the way they always were when he was fighting sleep and losing. He was 74. His hands, rough and wide from decades of work, rested on top of the blanket. Margaret held one of them in both of hers, pressing her lips together to hold back the sounds that wanted to escape her chest. "Maggie," he whispered. "I'm here, Daddy. I'm right here." He smiled, that slow, private smile that had always made her feel like the most important person in any room. "You're always here." She nodded and pressed his hand to her cheek. Across the room, the door opened. She assumed it was a nurse. She did not turn around immediately. She was whispering something to her father, something small and personal, the kind of words that belong only between a parent and a child in the final quiet chapters of a life. But then she heard the laugh, low, deliberate, unmistakable. Dominic's laugh. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway in his tuxedo, bow tie loosened with the practiced casualness of a man who wanted to appear relaxed but had planned every detail of his entrance. His teeth were bright in the dim hospital light. His hand rested on the lower back of a woman Margaret had never seen in person but had seen in photographs she had found 8 months ago, deleted from a phone she was never meant to touch. The woman's name was Candace. She was tall, dressed in a fitted gold dress that caught every sliver of light in the room, and she looked around the hospital with the expression of someone touring a property they intended to purchase. "Sorry to interrupt," Dominic said, in a voice that made it clear he was not sorry at all. Margaret stood, not quickly, slowly, with the quiet dignity of a woman who had been practicing stillness for years. "Dominic," her voice was even, "this is not the place." "No?" He tilted his head. "Funny, I think this is exactly the place." He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and held it out toward her. The room felt very small suddenly. The monitors kept beeping. Her father had gone still in the way old people do when they are listening more carefully than anyone realizes. "What is that?" Margaret asked, though something in her stomach already knew. "Your freedom," Dominic said, "and mine." Candace covered her mouth with manicured fingers, but not to suppress horror, to suppress a smile. She glanced at Dominic with shining eyes, as if they were watching a performance they had rehearsed together, which Margaret understood in that moment. They were. Margaret did not take the envelope. "Dominic, my father is dying. And I'm sorry about that, truly." He set the envelope on the edge of the bed, on the very bed where her father lay, and tapped it twice with 2 fingers. But Joseph was always practical. He'd understand. "Sign tonight and we can both move forward." Something passed across her father's face, a tightening around the eyes. Margaret saw it. "He's right here," she said quietly. "He can hear you." "Then he can witness," Dominic said, and smiled again, and Margaret understood that the smile was not for her, it was for Candace, a performance of dominance, a gift he was laying at her girlfriend's feet in the room where his wife's father was dying. The door opened again behind them. Margaret's younger sister, Denise, stepped in wearing a sequin dress and her husband Marcus's arm around her shoulder. They too had left the gala when the call came. She stopped. She looked at Dominic. She looked at the woman in gold. She looked at the envelope on the bed. Her face changed. "Dominic," Marcus said, in the careful voice men use when they are deciding whether a situation requires restraint, "you need to step outside." "I'm not talking to you, Marcus." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm talking to you." Dominic ignored him entirely. He looked at Margaret, and for a moment the performance slipped, just slightly, and what Margaret saw underneath was not cruelty exactly, but something smaller and sadder. A man who had never felt tall enough standing next to her, who had spent 6 years of marriage trying to reduce her to a height he could manage. "Just sign it," he said. "Tonight, right now." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Candace, who had the grace, finally, to drop her gaze to the floor. Then Margaret turned back to her father. Joseph Elias had his eyes fully open now. He was looking at his daughter with an expression Margaret could not immediately name. It was not pity, it was not sorrow, it was closer to certainty. The look of a man who has seen the end of a long story from the very first chapter and has been waiting, patiently, for the world to catch up. He squeezed her hand. "Maggie," he said, and his voice was stronger than it had been all evening, stronger than it had any right to be. "Reach into my coat, the gray one, on the chair." "Daddy, you don't have to." "Reach in," he said again, gently. She crossed to the chair in the corner where his belongings were folded, his gray wool coat, the one he had worn every winter for 15 years because he said it was perfectly good and there's no need to replace a thing that works. She reached into the inside breast pocket. Her fingers found an envelope. Not the thin, legal kind Dominic had brought. This one was thick, cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp she didn't recognize yet, a small, clean insignia that meant nothing to her yet. "That's from my lawyers," her father said. "Been waiting for the right moment to give it to you. I think—" He stopped and coughed softly, then settled back into his pillow with the satisfied exhale of a man laying down a weight he has carried a long time. Dominic laughed from across the room, short, dismissive. "Lawyers? Joseph was a school janitor for 30 years. The old man turned his head slowly and looked at Dominic the way a river looks at a stone, without anger, without hurry, with the quiet understanding that it will still be moving long after the stone is worn smooth. "Yes," Joseph Elias said simply. "I was." He said nothing more on the subject. Dominic laughed again, softer this time, and leaned toward Candace to murmur something in her ear. She smiled, but it was smaller now, as if some instinct in her was trying to tell her something her pride was not yet willing to receive. Margaret stood holding the cream envelope. She did not open it, not yet. She returned to her father's side and set it in her lap and took his hand again, and for a while the room was quiet, except for the monitors and the sound of rain beginning outside the window. "You're going to be all right," her father told her. "I know, Daddy." "No," he squeezed her hand with more strength than she expected. "I need you to really know that. Not the way you say it to make me feel better, the way you know the sun is coming." She looked at him. His eyes were steady and warm and absolutely certain. "Okay," she said softly. "I know." He nodded, satisfied. Dominic was still in the room, still performing for Candace, though the energy had shifted in some way none of them could fully explain. The way the air shifts before weather arrives, carrying information in advance of itself. He picked the manila envelope up from the bed and held it out toward Margaret. "I'll need an answer before I leave." Margaret looked at the envelope in his hand. Then she looked at the envelope in her lap. Then she looked at her father, who was watching her with those quiet, certain eyes.
She thought about the girl who used to ride on this man's shoulders. She thought about every school morning he packed her lunch, every graduation he attended in his good coat, every time she had come to him with a broken thing and he had sat with her until she could see her way through it. She thought about the fact that she did not yet know what was inside the envelope in her lap, but that her father, this man who had spent 30 years as a school janitor, who drove a used car, who brought lilies to his own hospital room because he had pre-ordered them for her visits, had called it something from his lawyers. Plural. She set Dominic's envelope aside, without opening it. "I'll need more time," she said. Dominic's jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, something moved across his face that was not amusement, but something almost panicked. "Margaret," he said, "my father is dying," and her voice did not shake, "and I am holding
his hand. Whatever else needs to happen will happen later." She turned back to her father. Denise stood quietly near the window. Marcus had placed himself between Dominic and the bed with the calm, unmovable posture of a man who had made a decision. Outside, the rain picked up. Joseph Elias closed his eyes, still holding his daughter's hand, still wearing that expression of absolute, unhurried certainty, like a man who has planted a tree 30 years ago and can hear, even now, the sound of it finally coming into full bloom. He passed quietly at 11:47 that night. Margaret was holding his hand when he went. The cream envelope sat in her lap, sealed, waiting. $30 billion of silence folded into paper, patient as her father had always been, ready to speak when the time was exactly right. And the time, Margaret Elias was beginning to understand, was almost right. The funeral home smelled of white roses and cedar wood, and Margaret had not slept in 4 days. She had not opened the envelope on the night her father died. She had not opened it the next morning either, when Dominic had sent 3 text messages before 8 o'clock asking about the divorce papers, or the afternoon after that, when his lawyer had called her personal cell phone, a number she had never given him, to discuss an amicable and timely resolution. She had held the cream envelope in both hands many times. She had turned it over, traced the wax seal with her thumb, held it up to the light of her bedroom window the way her father used to hold letters when she was small, squinting at the shadows inside, as if he could read them through the paper. She had laughed at herself for doing it, and then done it again. She was not ready, and then, on the 4th morning, she was. She sat at her father's kitchen table, his house, the small brick house in the quiet part of town where she had grown up, with the yellow curtains her mother had sewn before she passed, and the ceramic rooster on the counter that had always been there, and would, Margaret decided, always remain there. She made herself a cup of coffee, exactly the way her father made it, strong enough to be objected to being called coffee at all. She sat down. She broke the wax seal. Inside were 3 things. The first was a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, in her father's careful and unhurried script, the handwriting of a man who learned to write at a time when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. She set it aside to read last, because she knew if she read it first, she would not be able to see the other documents through her tears. The second was a business card, heavy stock, cream-colored like the envelope, embossed with gold lettering, Harmon, Elias and Associates, Private Wealth Management, a phone number, a name circled in her father's pen, Gerald Harmon, call him first. The third was a document, 12 pages, dense with legal language she only partially understood, but whose meaning became clear enough by the 3rd page to make her set her coffee cup down very carefully, with both hands, as if she were afraid of dropping it. Joseph Emmanuel Elias had a net worth of $31,200,000,000. Margaret sat with that sentence for a long time. She read it again. She read the page it was on 3 more times.
She turned to the next page and the next, following the careful architecture of a fortune she had never once suspected, assembled over decades through investments, private equity, real estate holdings across 11 states, and 3 technology companies in which her father had been a silent founding partner, a fact that had been kept quiet, legally and deliberately, for reasons the letter would later explain. Margaret Elaine Okafor, née Elias, was the sole heir. All of it, every dollar, every property, every share. She picked up her coffee. She put it down again. She pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed the way her father had taught her to breathe when the world became too large for the chest, slowly, through the nose, until the body remembers that it has handled hard things before and survived every single one of them. Then she picked up the letter. My Maggie. If you are reading this, then I have gone ahead to where your mother is, and I am not sorry about that. I have missed her every day for 19 years, and I imagine she has a great deal to say to me. I hope you can smile at that, even now. I want to tell you something I should have told you sooner, and I want to start by telling you why I didn't. Your grandfather came to this country with $11 and a suitcase. I watched him work himself into the ground for a dignity this world was not always willing to give him freely. I learned from him that money in the wrong hands at the wrong time does not build character, it reveals it. I decided when I was very young that I would earn everything quietly, build everything carefully, and only place it in the hands of someone whose character had been tested without the cushion of wealth to make the testing easier. I placed it in your hands, Maggie, because I have watched you for 34 years, and I have never once been cruel. I have seen you be tired and disappointed and afraid, but never cruel. That is rarer than any amount of money I could leave you. I worked as a janitor at that school for 30 years because I loved it. I want you to understand that clearly, not because I had to. I could have stopped after the first 10 years and lived the rest of my life on what had already been built. But those children needed someone to see them in the hallways, someone who wasn't grading them or evaluating them, just seeing them. I could afford to do that, so I did. The details of the estate are in the documents. Gerald Harmon has been my attorney and my friend for 26 years. He will guide you through everything, and you can trust him completely. There is one more thing. I saw the man your husband showed himself to be tonight. I saw it in the way he stood in that room, and in the way he laughed, and in the company he brought to my bedside to use as a weapon against my child. I am not angry at him. Anger at small things is a waste of a life. But I want you to hear this from me clearly as my last instruction to you. Do not be in a hurry. Do not react. Do not let him see the envelope until you have spoken to Gerald and understood every word of every document. Let him believe what he believes for a little while longer. The truth will introduce itself in its own time, and it will do so far more effectively than any argument you could make today. You are my $1,000,000 girl. You always were. I just never told you the full number. With all the love I have ever had, Daddy. Margaret folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest for a long time. Then she called Gerald Harmon. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been expecting her call days, which she would later learn he had. His voice was warm and measured, the voice of a man who had delivered enormous news to people enough times to understand that the news itself was only the beginning of the conversation. They spoke for 2 hours. By the time Margaret set her phone down, the yellow curtains in her father's kitchen were bright with mid-morning sun, her coffee was long cold, and the coordinates of her life had shifted so completely and so quietly that the world outside the window looked the same, while being, in every practical sense, entirely different. She called Denise. Her sister arrived in 20 minutes, still in her morning clothes, and sat across the table and read the documents in the order Margaret directed, and when she reached the third page, she made a sound that was not quite a word and looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. "Maggie, I know. Daddy, I know." Denise pressed her hand over her mouth exactly the way her father used to when he was choosing his words carefully. Then she said, "Does Dominic know?" "No." Denise was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across her face, a thought arriving in full, complete, and certain. She looked at her sister. "Are you going to sign those papers?" Margaret looked out the window at her father's yard, at the old oak tree her father had planted the year Margaret was born, which had grown, quietly and without anyone particularly watching, into something enormous and permanent and deeply rooted. "Yes," she said, "I am absolutely going to sign those papers." Denise raised an eyebrow. "On my timeline, after I have spoken to my attorneys. Plural." The words sat between them, and then Denise understood and smiled slow and wide, and reached across the table and covered her sister's hand. Gerald Harmon's offices occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that Margaret had walked past 100 times without ever looking up. The lobby was quiet, and the elevators were fast, and the receptionist greeted her by name before she had said a word, which told her something about how long her arrival had been anticipated and prepared for. Gerald himself was 60, with silver hair and the unhurried posture of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He shook her hand warmly and showed her to a conference room with a long
mahogany table and a view of the city that made the city look like something her father had quietly owned. She met the team over the next 3 days: estate attorneys, tax strategists, the CFO of her father's private equity firm, a firm with a name she had never heard, which had nonetheless been operating successfully for 22 years. She met the 3 technology founders who had spent 2 decades referring to her father only as our silent partner Jay, and who, upon learning that Jay had passed and that her daughter was sitting across the table from them, became very still and very respectful in the way people become when they realize they are in the presence of someone whose scale they had underestimated. She asked good questions. She listened more than she spoke. She took notes in a small leather notebook Gerald gave her on the first day, and she filled it, and he gave her another. At night she went back to her apartment, the apartment she and Dominic shared, which he had largely vacated in favor of Candace's place across town, and she sat in the silence and thought about her father mopping hallways and packing lunches and driving his used car, and never once, not for a single morning of her life, making her feel like anything less than the center of the world. She thought about the way he had looked at Dominic in that hospital room. Not with anger, with patience. The deep, geological patience of a man who understood that certain reckonings cannot be rushed. They can only be prepared for, so that when they arrive, you are standing on solid ground. On the 10th day after her father's passing, Margaret called Dominic. He answered with the careful neutrality of a man who had been coached by his own attorney. "I'm ready to discuss the divorce," she said. She heard the satisfaction in his exhale before he controlled it. "Good, I think that's—" "My attorneys will be in touch with yours to schedule the meeting," she said. A pause. "Your attorneys?" he repeated. "Yes. Margaret, you don't need to make this complicated. It's a straightforward—" "My attorneys," she said again pleasantly, "will be in touch." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, looking around at the furniture they had chosen together, the art on the walls, the life assembled piece by piece over 6 years that had turned out, on close inspection, to be mostly a set, a backdrop for a performance in which she had been cast, without her knowledge, as a supporting role. She stood, picked up her keys, and went back to her father's house. She wanted to sit at his table one more time before everything changed. She wanted to look at the yellow curtains, and the ceramic rooster, and the old oak tree in the yard, and remember who she had been before the world knew what she was worth. Because that woman, she understood now, was not gone. She was the foundation. Everything else was about to be built on top of her. Dominic's attorney called Gerald Harmon's office the following morning to schedule the divorce proceedings. Gerald's paralegal, a composed young woman named Teresa, took the call and was polite and efficient. She noted the time, confirmed the date, and relayed the details to Margaret's full legal team, which now numbered 11 people. When she told Dominic's attorney how many representatives would be present on Margaret's side, there was a pause on the line long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I'm sorry," said the attorney carefully. "How many?" 11, said Teresa pleasantly. "Will that be a problem for the room size?" Another pause. "No," he said in the voice of a man beginning to feel the first cold shadow of a very large thing passing overhead. He hung up and called Dominic immediately. And Dominic, who had spent 11 days feeling like a man who had won something, began, slowly, imprecisely, without yet being able to name the sensation, began to feel like a man who had made a very serious miscalculation. He just didn't know how serious. The conference room on the 14th floor of Harmon, Elias and Associates was the kind of room that did not need to announce its seriousness. It announced itself through the quality of its silence, the weight of the mahogany table that seated 20, the view of the city spread below like a map of everything that was possible when patience was treated as a strategy rather than a weakness. Margaret arrived first. She wore ivory, not white, ivory, the color of something aged into its full strength. Her hair was pinned back simply, the way her father had always liked it, and her only jewelry was her mother's pearl earrings, which she had not worn since the funeral. She carried nothing except a slim leather portfolio and the quiet, settled energy of a woman who had spent 11 days becoming absolutely certain of who she was. Gerald Harmon sat to her right. To her left sat Diana Osai, her lead divorce attorney, a woman whose reputation in the city's legal community was spoken of in the careful tones people reserve for weather systems and acts of God. The remaining 9 members of Margaret's team filled the chairs around them with the composed efficiency of people who had reviewed every document 3 times and had not found a single thread worth pulling on Dominic's behalf. They were arranged and ready at 9:45. Dominic arrived at 10:03. He came in with 2 people. His attorney, a man named Patterson, who specialized in high net worth divorces and had built his practice on the assumption that high net worth always referred to the husband, and a younger associate carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and was. Dominic himself wore a charcoal suit and the carefully arranged expression of a man performing confidence for an audience. He saw Margaret. He saw Gerald Harmon. He saw Diana Osai, whose name he did not yet know but whose presence registered somewhere in the back of his mind as a variable he had not accounted for. Then he counted the people at the table. His eyes moved along the row of faces slowly. Something shifted in his jaw. He sat down. Patterson set his briefcase on the table with a click and opened it and produced a copy of the divorce filing, the same basic document that Dominic had attempted to serve at his father's deathbed, now formally processed and dated. "We appreciate everyone's time," Patterson began, with the smooth efficiency of a man who believed this meeting would last 90 minutes at most.
Our position is straightforward. The marriage is irretrievably broken. We're seeking a clean dissolution based on the assets accrued during the term of the marriage, which our assessment places at. Before we proceed, Diana said in a voice like a door closing softly but with absolute finality, we'd like to enter several items into the record. Patterson paused. Of course. Diana nodded to Teresa, who was seated near the wall, and Teresa opened a separate folder and began distributing documents around the table with the calm precision of someone who had done this before and found it satisfying. Every time. Dominic picked up the document in front of him and read the first page. He read it again. He looked up at Margaret. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 6 years of marriage. Not anger, not grief, not the particular brand of tired sadness she had carried for the last 2 years of their relationship. She was looking at him with the calm, clear regard of a woman who no longer needed anything from him, not even an apology, which would have been appropriate. "What is this?" Dominic said. His voice was steady, but Patterson placed a hand briefly on his arm, in the way attorneys do when they are trying to prevent their clients from making the next few minutes worse than they need to be. "This," Diana said, "is a disclosure of assets belonging to my client, Margaret Elaine Elias O'Coffer, as the sole heir of the estate of Joseph Emmanuel Elias, which was formally transferred and established before Mr. Elias's passing 10 days ago." She let that settle for precisely 3 seconds. "The estate," she continued, "is valued at $31,200,000,000. The room was very quiet. Patterson had stopped moving. His younger associate had a pen in his hand that he appeared to have forgotten about, hovering it above a legal pad without touching it. Dominic sat with the document in his hands and the particular stillness of a man whose internal architecture was in the process of rapid, involuntary restructuring. "That's," Patterson started, then stopped. "Correct," Gerald Harmon said pleasantly. He folded his hands on the table in a way that communicated he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. "We have the full documentation available for your review. Audited financials going back 22 years, property portfolios, investment records, and the official estate transfer documents,
Properly filed and registered." Dominic put the document down. He looked at Margaret again, and this time something real moved across his face. Something beneath the performance, beneath the charcoal suit and the practiced ease. It was the expression of a man watching the entire premise of a story he told himself collapse from the foundation upward. He had married Margaret 8 years into her father's quiet accumulation of a fortune that would have placed Joseph Elias comfortably among the wealthiest people in the country. He had spent 6 years treating his wife as a liability to be managed and ultimately discarded. He had stood at her father's bedside with another woman and laughed. He had held out divorce papers over the hand of a dying billionaire's daughter and tapped them twice with 2 fingers. "I'd like a moment," Dominic said. "Of course," Diana said. He and Patterson stepped out. Margaret did not watch them go. She looked out the window at the city below, at the streets her father had driven through for 30 years in his used car, at the building across the way where one of his quietly held companies occupied 3 floors, at the sky, which was the same sky it had always been, enormous and indifferent and full of light. Denise was seated 3 chairs down from her. Margaret had insisted she be present, not as a legal representative, but as family, because their father had always said that the most important decisions in a person's life should be witnessed by someone who loves them. Denise caught her eye and said nothing, only pressed her lips together in the soft, private way that meant, "I am here, and I am with you," and Daddy would have loved this moment. Margaret allowed herself one small, brief smile. Then she straightened her portfolio and waited. In the hallway outside, Dominic stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling. Patterson spoke to him in a low, rapid voice, recalibrating in real time, running numbers and implications through the mental framework of a man whose entire strategy had just been built on sand. "We need to understand the asset structure," Patterson said. "If the estate was transferred before the marriage legally ends, and if any of those assets were commingled during the marriage in any way—" "They weren't," Dominic said. "You don't know that." "I didn't know any of it existed." His voice was flat. "She didn't know any of it existed." Patterson straightened his tie. "Then our exposure is limited to the marital assets, which is where we started. But Dominic—" He stopped and chose his next words with great care. "The dynamic in that room has changed considerably." "I noticed," Dominic said. "She has 11 people at that table. Gerald Harmon has been in this industry for 30 years, and he does not take routine cases. Diana Osei has not lost a divorce proceeding in—" "I know who Diana Osei is," Dominic said quietly, which was not true 60 seconds ago, but something he was frantically processing in real time. "What I'm telling you, carefully, is that we should consider whether an aggressive posture continues to serve your interests in this particular situation." Dominic was quiet for a moment. In the silence of that hallway, with the city noise faint 14 floors below, he thought about a hospital room and a woman in a blue dress sitting beside her father's bed. He thought about the envelope he had tapped twice with 2 fingers. He thought about Candace in her gold dress standing at the door like a statement. He thought about the look on Joseph Elias's face, that quiet river and stone look, and he understood now what he had not understood then, what the old man had known and chosen not to say, because he had decided that the moment and the manner of the saying would belong entirely to his daughter. "What are our options?" Dominic asked. Patterson exhaled. "We settle. Cleanly, fairly, and quickly. We make no claims against the inherited estate, which we have no grounds for regardless. We negotiate the marital asset division respectfully, and we conclude this without litigation." "And if we don't?" Patterson looked at him steadily. "Then we litigate against a team of 11, led by Gerald Harmon and Diana Osei, on behalf of a woman who just inherited $31 billion and has every resource available to her that exists in the legal profession." He paused. "I would not recommend it." Dominic straightened his jacket. "Set up the settlement discussion," he said. They returned to the conference room. What followed was 3 hours of careful, professional negotiation conducted entirely without the theater of the 11 days. Patterson had shed his earlier confidence like a coat that no longer fit. He was measured, cooperative, and precise. Dominic sat beside him and spoke only when asked direct questions. And when he spoke, he was quiet and without performance, as if whatever had powered the performance had run out of fuel entirely. The marital assets were straightforward. The apartment, which was in both their names, 2 vehicles, a joint investment account, a modest sum in shared savings. Diana and Patterson moved through each item methodically, and Margaret answered questions when Diana addressed her and otherwise remained still and clear-eyed and patient. At one point, Patterson attempted, gently, to reference the significant change in circumstances as context for the asset division, and Diana looked at him with a patience so thorough it bordered on educational and said, "The estate is entirely separate property under every applicable statute, and we won't be revisiting that." Patterson nodded and moved on. Near the end of the 3rd hour, Diana placed a final document on the table.
There is one remaining item. My client has prepared a statement which she would like to read into the record personally. Patterson glanced at Dominic. Dominic said nothing. Margaret opened her leather portfolio for the first time. She had written it herself at her father's kitchen table the night before, in the light of the yellow curtains, with her mother's old pen that still worked and always had. She read it quietly and without drama. I am not here today to punish anyone or to make any point beyond what the facts already make on their own. My father was a quiet man who built an enormous life without ever needing anyone outside this family to know about it. He taught me that dignity is something the world gives you. It is something you maintain regardless of what the world does. I maintained mine. I intend to continue doing so. She turned the page. I am signing these divorce papers today because this marriage ended long before this meeting, and I see no reason to delay the beginning of what comes next. What comes next for me is substantial. I intend to honor my father's legacy by building on what he built, carefully, quietly, and with great attention to who deserves a seat at the table. She looked up briefly, not at Dominic specifically, at the room. I wish everyone present a productive future. That is all. She closed the portfolio. Diana slid the final papers across the table. Margaret uncapped her mother's pen, the old one, the one that still worked and always had, and signed her name. Margaret Elaine Elias. She had quietly dropped the Okafor the week before in a small legal amendment Gerald had processed without ceremony. It took 11 minutes and cost nothing. She was her father's daughter, fully and completely, in every sense that now mattered. 3 months later, Margaret sat in the corner office of the newly established Elias Family Foundation, on the 14th floor of a building her father had owned for 16 years without anyone knowing it, looking out at the city he had moved through quietly and thoroughly and with profound intention for 40 years. The foundation's first major initiative was a scholarship program for children from under-resourced schools, the same kind of schools that Joseph Elias had spent 30 years mopping floors and watching children in the hallways and making sure they felt seen. Denise was her co-director. Marcus handled operations. Gerald Harmon remained her advisor and had become, in the months since the reading of the will, something closer to family, the kind of family you find rather than inherit, which Joseph had always said was the best kind. The scholarship was named simply the Joseph E. Elias Award for young people who are not yet who they will be. It was, every person who read it agreed, exactly the right name. Margaret heard through mutual acquaintances, as one always eventually does, that Dominic and Candace had moved in together and that things were not going particularly well. She received this information without satisfaction and without sorrow. She filed it in the same category where she kept all information that did not concern her future, which had become in recent months a